Hello, this is Mr. Mitchell. We have a video about a dark brown dog. We've already talked a little bit about a dark brown dog a little in class, and let's do some more literary analysis. So you have some notes to take on the Google Doc that is in the Google Classroom. So let's first talk about the dog, and you know from class that the dog represents in this allegory newly freed slaves. So I kind of want to point out a couple of things about the dog. This first part was on your questions from before. The dog was dragging a leash, and it wasn't a full leash, it was a partial leash, as if he had escaped or been set free, which is what had happened with the newly freed slaves. Now keep in mind, this story was written about 35 years after the Civil War, so it wasn't newly freed slaves, but these were slaves that still did not have the rights of human beings in the United States. So another thing I want to point out about the dog is what is mentioned in paragraph 3. In paragraph 3, the dog walks around with an intent air. Intent means having intentions. He had intentions of going out and about and being part of society, like I'm sure newly freed slaves had intentions of being. He had an intent air. However, after the dog interacts with the child, by paragraph 8, he carried the air of a footpad, as in something that somebody would place their foot on top of. So he went from, what a change here, the intent air of feeling free and feeling new to being just something that someone would trod upon. So you really had quite a change here, and that kind of leads me to believe that this analogy was correct, that Mr. Crane, who wrote this, wanted to make the dog represent newly freed slaves. So now let's talk a little bit about the child. You may remember that the child is supposed to represent the new generation of white Southerners. So what can we say about them? Well, the child first struck the dog in the head, and this is in paragraph 3, and you may remember it was just as what seemed to be an innocent reaction, not reaction, but an innocent interaction between the dog and child. And then once the dog ended up trying to I think the phrase was topple over the child. I mean, the dog was just happy. Then that's when the dog got struck in the head. And everything seems to change after that. Now, I'm going to fast forward to near the end of the story whenever I say this. Paid no attention to calls. That is, the father paid no attention to the calls of the child. This goes to show you that the child, the allegorical white Southerners of the day, the child really was unattended to. These white Southerners were not given any notice. They were not given any direction as to how society should function now that you had the newly freed slaves. So as a result, they were like a little child that didn't always do the right thing. And goodness knows this child didn't always do the right thing. And to kind of go with that, to how infantile the child was, at the very end, when the child was trying to see the dog after the dog had been thrown down the window, he went downstairs backwards. By going downstairs backwards, that shows you just how small a child this is. And by having the author make this child very small and very infantile and very unattended to by the parents, it shows you that the situation of how citizens were not really prepared to react to this new normal. And it was just not a good situation overall at all. Which brings us to the father. The father, of course, is the most abusive figure in the entire story, the father represents the Jim Crow laws. Now, you may remember the Jim Crow laws were passed years after the Civil War in an effort to try to not give citizenship, to not give the rights of citizenship to newly freed slaves. So this was kind of a way of southern states and southern municipalities to keep slaves down, to repress slaves. So I have added other repression here. Let's talk about the father. The father knocked down the dog with a coffee pot. Now, so very abusive here, but he ended up just, he established dominion over the dog. I mean, there wasn't any peer interaction here at all. You didn't have equals at all. And under the law, we were supposed to have equality, but this was nowhere near. It was establishing dominion over the dog. Now, another thing I want to point out about the father was, well, one of the things that's very memorable about this story, not for a good reason, but the father threw the dog out the window. So just like hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan had lynchings in the South, the father just discarded the unwanted brown dog. Just discarded him completely whenever things, he finally just had a whim to do that. There really wasn't any reason at all for this to happen. Also, to point out the dominion of the Jim Crow laws and of the father, it mentions about midway through the story that the father quelled a fierce rebellion of his wife. So the wife may have protested the laws, or other parts of the government may have protested the laws, but they really didn't have dominion over the people that were making these laws. So whatever rebellion that any other person or any other government agency had, it just didn't help at all. And finally, talking about the father, this may be what might be considered the other people. When the father threw the dog out the window, other people looked and they were amazed, and one of them had their mouth filled with clothespins as if they were gagged. They couldn't really say anything about the father who was throwing the dog out the window. Okay, I think we get to number 2, where it talks about sophisticated language and cruelty. One of the ironies of this story is that Stephen Crane, who wrote this, uses very sophisticated language, but the story is just a cruel base story, and it's kind of ironic. It's not what you expect sophisticated language would talk about. In the very first few paragraphs, we have several examples. Instead of communicating or talking with the dog, they had an interview with the dog, and the dog had an interview with the child, and the dog had gleeful caperings. I mean, this is not language you would use when talking about cruelty to animals or cruelty to people, and that's part of the irony of here. Even at the very end, there were, this should say leaned perilously, but there was like a neighbor who leaned perilously over something to see the dog fall. And they vented an exclamation. I mean, they didn't shout, they vented an exclamation. I find that very interesting, that this is one of the ironic parts of this particular story. And finally, I mentioned the term carnival killing. Right before the father ended up killing the dog, it was like everything had joy to it. At the first, it said that he held a carnival whenever he got home drunk that day. And some interesting wordings after that. he had a huge howl of joy whenever he hit the dog with the coffee pot. You may remember he hit the dog with the coffee pot twice, and he had joy. It was like entertainment to him. And that's also another irony of this story, that you have entertaining things that are cruel and cringing to us as readers. It mentioned that the father was in the mood for having fun, so he threw the dog out the window. And it's just really not how things should be. You know, I think that is the point here, that what is happening in the Jim Crow South is not how things should be in the late 1890s and early 1900s. Uh, Notice the term hilariously. I mean, who is going to swing a dog hilariously to hurl him down to his death? No one is. Well, I hope we've had some good discussion as far as the literary analysis about the dog, the child, the father, and the language that is used, the ironies of the situation. Use this to fill out the note page. Hope you've learned a little. Thank you.